Some 30 years ago, the American rock singer Madonna told us that we were living in a material world. She was a material girl, she said. And in that 30 years, many will have sounded the death knell of the church and said the church has got nothing left to offer, no message that engages with people today. I'm in conversation with Archdeacon Andrew Jones, the Archdeacon of Meirionydd, following the publication of his most recent book, Mary, A Gospel Witness to Transfiguration and Liberation. And I hope that we'll be able to tease out some questions why there is still within Christian faith an awful lot to stimulate, why spirituality has come back to the fore, and perhaps why Madonna's material world is found to be lacking. Andrew, welcome. It's good to have you here. The inspiration for this book, I sense, has been long in the making. What was the inspiration for you in writing this book?
Well, it all started about 10 years ago when I was invited to lead a joint Anglican Roman Catholic retreat on Montserrat, which is the leading shrine to the Virgin Mary in Spain, the second most important place of pilgrimage in Spain, first being Santiago de Compostela. And Montserrat is situated just outside Barcelona. And as a theme, there were two of us leading, one Roman Catholic and myself. And as a provocative theme, I asked those on the retreat to imagine that they had visited all the Marian shrines in the world, and there are, as you know, hundreds of them, all of them. And they were well versed geographically in these different places and had enjoyed them and so on and so forth. And then I asked them to imagine that they had never read the Gospels. They weren't well versed in the Gospels, but when they got home, when they went home, to read the references which I'd given them in the New Testament to Mary. And I asked them, I wonder what your reaction would be. And of course, the reaction I was trying to draw out was one of shock. Gosh, so little, so little. But of course, in reality, had there just been one reference in the New Testament, that would have been enough. Because, you know, the provocation there was we build this huge edifice around Mary, but there is so little about her in the New Testament. But then if that's true for Mary, it's true for the Eucharist. And it is also true for the Trinity.
So where did the story grow from there? Because you've now in front of you a book that is the result of many years of reflection. What happened since that time that's brought you to today?
Well, I'd already published a book for BRF, and Naomi Starkey, the editor, invited me to consider writing another one, and I felt that maybe as a result of those experiences in Montserrat and elsewhere, that I would like to tackle Mary. And three reasons, I guess, three of the most important reasons, apart from being invited. Apparently there was a gap in the market for a book of substance by a non-Roman Catholic writer. And but there were three reasons. First two probably slightly negative. Mary clearly is a key gospel player, but sadly for too many and for too long she has been seen as a figure of division, as opposed to be seen as a figure of unity, Mary for all Christians. It's the first thing. I wanted to have a bash at dispelling that. The second, and still slightly negative, was here we had a key gospel player, but for far too many people, the approach is oversimplistic. She is humble, she's lowly, she's obedient. And I wanted to ask the question, but what else? There must be much more. And so I was seeking the much more. And then the third thing was that, you know, she played a vital role in the whole process of the Incarnation. The title that I quite enjoyed unpacking and using in the book was that she was the bearer of the Incarnation.
Lovely, lovely. I love that phrase, bearer of the Incarnation. And of course you offer us a particular set of lenses through which to see and understand Mary. Two key words, transfiguration and liberation. You take first of all that extraordinary story in which Jesus goes to the mountain, takes with him a select few, and there he is transfigured. But you suggest in your book that Mary too, throughout her life, experiences transfiguration. Tell us about that.
Well, let me explain first why I went for those two words. The background to that is that many years ago, when I started studying theology here in Bangor, one of the tutors said, look, as you begin this journey of studying theology, think of a biblical story. Think of a biblical story that you can use maybe for the rest of your life, that you can hook onto that biblical story so much that you encounter in life. And secondly, think of your approach, think of your methodology, a very Germanic thing in many ways. In the British theologians do it in a more higgledy way, but the Germans are hot on methodology, theological methodology. So I went for the story of the Transfiguration as my story, and it has stuck with me for the whole of my life and has been an important story. Part of the reason why I went for the Transfiguration was that of all the biblical experience, of all the experiences in the New Testament relating to Christ, I think it's the experience that Christians find easy to get their heads round. Put on one side the cloud and the conversation with Moses and Elijah, but think of what happened. Jesus went up Mount Tabor, Peter, James and John, and they glimpsed heaven, and they went down and they were strengthened. Now, that's how people can, I think, get their heads around the Transfiguration, because we know, most of us, what it's like to be transformed, to be repaired, to be renewed, to move on in a more transfiguring way. And then liberation. I adopted that as my methodology. I mean, there are lots of ways of doing theology. You know, you could take the empirical model, base everything on your experience of the religious tradition and quantify, measure it, and then you can get a theology out of it. Yeah. Pastoral is another one. The church responding to pastoral situations in ministry, for instance, reflecting on it. Mine was liberation, the message of God setting his people free. Yeah. And setting his people free, that methodology means rooting your theological reflection in reality. It's an approach that then becomes informed by different experiences of life, political, social, cultural, sexual, gender, etc. Mary encountered two major perplexities in her life. One at the beginning of her ministry, if I can call it that. One that happened in Nazareth, her encounter with Gabriel, her encounter with the angel, and it was perplexing, this strange message that she was to bear a child. And the second perplexity was, of course, at the end of John's Gospel, when she stood at the foot of the cross, of course. And trying to make sense of that. And she became a transfigured woman in the way I think she moved on from that perplexity, and the way she was set free, liberated. And so I explore the relationship, I think, between doing theology in a liberationist way and hooking it onto the Transfiguration.
And of course, in relation to that thing about liberation, she was, of course, in the biblical story, a lowly figure. So she was the one to whom God came. And God, you argue in the book, is on the side of the Marys, those on the margins, those who feel that God is not with them, and then discover extraordinarily that he is. Mary is the subject, if you like, of God's richest grace. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath lifted up the lowly, and so forth. So she is, in that sense, I suppose, she is an example and a model for those of us who do feel on the margins.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I enjoyed most about writing the book was engaging with the biblical witness, the evidence. And it was suggested by a colleague of mine, why don't you trace her roots beyond the New Testament? And instead of tracing her to what happened after the crucifixion, I decided to trace her back into the Old Testament.
Yes.
And Hans Urs von Balthasar, a theologian in the Roman Catholic tradition, plays a great deal of his theological reflection on the Hebrew word anawim.
Yeah.
Anawim. It's a lovely word. It's not a lovely experience because it's the verb, of course, Hebrew verb for the oppressed ones.
Yes.
But you can translate it. It's an ambiguous word in many ways. You can translate it, and I use this particular translation, the little ones, the little people,
Yes.
in your sense, the people on the margin.
Yeah.
And you notice the way in which, throughout the Old Testament tradition, God is on the side of the oppressed. And the Anawim emerge as the ones through whom God reveals himself to all kinds of different people. So the engaging with the biblical witness was exhilarating. I enjoyed it immensely. And particularly then, moving into the Gospels. It's interesting, coming back to what I said about the retreat on Montserrat, you will know that there are 11 basic references to Mary in the New Testament,
Yes.
most of them in the Gospels. There's that one by Paul in Galatians 4:4 where she's not named.
Yeah.
There is an ambiguous reference in the in Revelation, and of course there is at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles where she is named, where she prays with the disciples. But interestingly, the 11 references, of the 11 references, only 5 groups of references mention her by name. Only 5. And those 5 mention her, if you can follow me, 18 times. So in the New Testament she's mentioned by name 18 times. Never by John. She's referred to as woman. Once by Mark, an indirect reference where the people are tracing Jesus' lineage and mention, oh yes, he's the son of Mary. But Matthew and Luke are the main evangelists to mention Mary. But it's interesting because Matthew mentions Mary by name only 4 times, but Matthew mentions Joseph 9 times.
Yes, of course.
The main parent in Matthew, I think, is Joseph. It's to Joseph, of course, that the Annunciation, albeit in a dream, but the Annunciation is to is to Joseph and not to Mary. Now in Luke, it's the opposite.
It is.
She's mentioned 14 times by name, and Joseph is mentioned 3 times. And Luke is clearly on the side of Mary.
Now I want to pick up on this whole biblical material things because I right, I think in saying this that you haven't skirted around some of the big stories, some of the most controversial aspects about Mary, whether you think that Mary was assumed, and you have a particular take in the way in which you think perhaps the birthday of the church might be celebrated in your dealing with John's material. Have you avoided the controversies around Mary?
No, I don't think I have. Let me pick up on what you say about the birthday. You know, when do you celebrate? When can the church justify saying, well, this is the birthday of the church? Pentecost? coming down of the Holy Spirit? Maybe. In the manger at Bethlehem? Maybe. The Annunciation to Mary? Maybe. On the cross? Possibly. The resurrection? Maybe. Now, for me, it's at the foot of the cross, not the actual crucifixion, but what happened around the foot of the cross.
And why do you say that?
Well, because a new community was formed. Jesus, as you know, presents Mary to John, and then turns to John and said, "Here is your mother." It's in that sense, I think, you can begin to make sense of the title, Mary, Mother of the Church. That's where she becomes the mother of the church.
Warmed to that. I thought that was a tantalising prospect and a really helpful way of understanding the whole Gospel of John as about a community, and perhaps certainly for that community, the point at which maybe the work of God was being completed, and if not perhaps for the whole of the Christian church, certainly in relation to the community of the beloved disciple. But
Yes.
what about those other controversial things Mary assumed? I mean, there's nothing in the Bible about that at all, is there?
No, not at all. The second thing I enjoyed most about the book was the looking at Mary through ecumenical lenses. And of course, you mentioned the two controversial dogmas of the Church. First, 1854, under the guidance of Pius IX, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And then, nearly 100 years later, Pius XI, the dogma of the Assumption. The dogma of the Assumption. Immaculate Conception, the controversy about the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, it refers to Mary. It doesn't refer to the fact of the virgin birth of Jesus. It refers to the fact that Mary was conceived immaculately,
Yes.
that Jehoiakim was not her, was simply her earthly father, a bit like Joseph and Jesus, and that Anna was also, and back in history, that her roots were conceived immaculately. Dogma of the Assumption is, of course, that she didn't die. It's interesting, the Orthodox Church referred to her death as a falling asleep,
Yes.
The Dormition of Mary.
Which, of course, is present in the Anglican prayer book. The Dormition of Mary is...
That's right. Yes, it is. It is. Yes, and so I have chapters on both of those, and the other slightly controversial aspect of Mary in the church was the hopes. It was a real hope in the Second Vatican Council during the early 60s that John the 23rd would issue a new statement on Mary. And a new dogma, but he refused. There was a vote taken, and there was only a narrow. The fathers of the church, the bishops, the cardinals, voted narrowly in favour of not having a separate dogma, a separate document, but that she was referred to in the document Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution of the church. And so John the 23rd, followed by Paul VI, was keen to incorporate Mary, the figure of Mary, within the constitution of the church, a dogmatic constitution on the life of the church, and talked in terms of Mary's continuing ministry.
Well, one last thing, Andrew, as we draw this to a close now. You must have hopes that this book will inspire a kind of devotion to Mary and be a resource for personal living in their own lives. Yes,
I think the two main writers that have influenced me on Mary, two women, two South American women, Ivona Guevara, who is a religious sister in Sao Paulo, and Maria Clara Bingen, who is an academic and a mother in Rio de Janeiro. And both of them write along the lines of liberation theology and talk in terms, again, of Mary's continuing ministry. That is, she has a ministry in these many, not least in these many places worldwide where she is commemorated, where she has appeared, and so on. And I think I was asked, leading a seminar some weeks ago, and one of the people asked me, what effect has writing a book on Mary had on you? I was conscious of the question. I think in many ways it's too early to answer the question, but certainly in a very powerful way, the process of writing the book energized and revitalized my own spiritual life, not least by visiting some of the places, but creating a new relationship with Mary.
And that must be the greatest commendation for this book, which of course is published by BRF. I've been in conversation today with the Archdeacon of Meirionydd in the Diocese of Bangor, the Venerable Andrew Jones. His book is published, as I said, by BRF, available from all good bookstores, and especially Christian ones, Mary, A Gospel Witness, The Transfiguration and Liberation. I hope it encourages your life and your devotion in and through our Lord Jesus Christ.